You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture with Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb and Dr. Fredrick J. Long. Welcome and enjoy.
So I just want to welcome you to the Greek reading group through Ephesians, where we've stopped at verse 18 of chapter 1, right around here. And so I'd like to pick us up right at that point, just as a little overview. Paul transitions in verse 15, which shows a syndeton, which is a lack of a conjunction. But and a syndeton can mean either a break or no relationship, which may imply a break, or a close connection in a parallel statement or in a kind of an emotional flourish. Here, there's not really a flourish going on, like a rhetorical flourish. There has been a high point to the praise of his glory, which we saw in 1 through 14 was a repeating refrain that provides some structure to the opening blessing of 1:3 to 14. So then in verse 15 here, the dia tuto is a anaphoric referent back. The tuto reflects back to the previous discourse, and we might debate how particular does it refer back. Does it refer back to the whole blessing that Paul is acknowledging, or perhaps to the last point, which is particularly the belief of the audience, you having heard the word of truth, that is the gospel of your salvation, in which also believing you were sealed. Seal that is officially marked. And if that's the case, it may be that Paul particularly is referring back to the conversion, the hearing and believing and the official sealing that has occurred particularly to his audience, those receiving this letter as a circular letter or one that might have gone only to Ephesus, although I believe it was a circular letter. And so the dia tuto may be particularly referring back then to a conversion. And it's because of this, having heard of your faith and love for all the saints. So particularly in light of hearing about their conversion and being sealed. So on account of this reason, as a basis for his subsequent action, he does not stop giving thanks and then makes remembrance in terms of prayers, his prayers. So the dia tuto is ends up being a logical connector with a anaphoric referent back. So while there's no conjunction here, indicating probably a break, on the other hand, there is a referent back via the dia tuto to what he's just said. And that makes sense because he's now offering up prayers for them. And so this prayer, the prayers are given content through technically what would be an epexegetical clause, that is a clause that refers back to some noun. And here's the prayers. In a sense, it's kind of like the content of the prayers, the praying. And so then in verse 17, we get the prayer itself. And as we noted last time, there is a lot of clarification of identity. Who God is. The God is God of the Lord. Who is the Lord? The Lord is Jesus Christ. So it's clarified who our Lord is. Our Lord is Jesus Christ. No other Lord implied. And God is not only in relationship to Jesus as Lord, but God is given appositional clarification as the Father of glory. Okay, so we learn a lot about who God is, who the Lord is, and then as the content of the prayers, then we get the main content, and that content is namely Paul is praying that this God of this Lord Jesus, that the God, the Father of glory, the Father of all renown, would give to you a spirit that is wise, a spirit that is revelatory. So basically a spirit that has these kind of characteristics. And I don't think this is the Holy Spirit. I think this is a disposition, a kind of an inward disposition of wisdom and revelation. And this particularly comes about through the means. That's what this end preposition is doing. Through the means of having a knowledge of Jesus Christ. In the knowledge of Him. In knowing Him. So what this means is that the way that we receive this disposition of wisdom and revelation, the way that we get that is through knowing Jesus. And that makes sense. Epigenosis, knowing Him, in the knowledge of Him. So in verse 18 we have something that scholars would call an accusative absolute statement, kind of like a genitive absolute. You know, when we think of a genitive absolute, it signals that there's a circumstance that's happening that's associated with the main verb, but that situation has a verbal component that has a different subject, typically, than the main verb. So that's what a genitive absolute is. A genitive absolute is when you have a different subject, typically, or different view of the subject with a different verbal idea, and it's put as a subordinate clause in relationship to the main verb. And there's whole studies been done on why this occurs. Here we have what is called an accusative absolute. And that's even rarer. People will struggle to say, well, why is it put into the accusative? Is Paul going back to the dative, to the you? Well, that's a different case, so I don't think so. I mean, obviously it refers to the you, but here we see that there's a textual variant that is a scribe has added a you. Scribes have added a you here to clarify whose heart it is, which may be implied. Now you can see that here in the apparatus that there's a C, which means that the editors of this UBS text that we're looking at, UBS 5, they're uncertain whether this you should be there or not. So C indicates a low confidence rating. And the reason why is because you can see that in support of the omission, if you go halfway down this list, you see the double slashes and you see the omit. This is omitted in our earliest manuscript, P46, and by Codex Vaticanus, which is very old as well, not as old as P46. And so these two great witnesses are at odds with Codex Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus. So you have a split of these important manuscripts. Moreover, notice that you have Marcion, according to Tertullian, and then the minuscule 1739. That's a pretty reliable. It's a minuscule, but its text type is early. It seems to have been reliant on an earlier text tradition. So this is a debate. That's why they give it a C rating. Now, does it change the meaning? No, because we know probably whose eyes, who this belongs to. We know it belongs to the audience, the you. So it's not really an issue. It's just that some manuscripts have this, some don't, and there's some debate about whether it should really be there or not. So this is an accusative absolute, and we have to ask, what is it doing there? Now notice that it's ramped up because it's a perfect tense participle. It's ramped up. It breaks the grammar. It's a bit of an aside in a sense. And yet Paul also ramps it up a bit by putting it into the perfect tense. Having been illuminated. So it's from the verb photidzo. Photidzo, enlightened. So the eyes is the subject, so to speak. It's the accusative of reference in relation to the participle. It's kind of like a genitive absolute, how the subject of the genitive participle is put into the genitive case. Here, with an accusative absolute construction, the subject of the accusative participle is put into the accusative case. So it's the eyes of the heart, or your heart, having been illuminated already. I think that's what's implied. Now the function of this, as I spoke last time, it's an important point. And the fact that we have a perfect participle, right, is indicating that something has happened with continued results. So, and I think this phrase serves a really important function, because Paul needs to be careful to not make it seem that they're deficient. You're lacking. No, you already have a very significant foundation. In fact, the eyes of your heart have already been illuminated. And I think that's what he's saying here. In fact, it's out of this initial illumination that continues. It's resultant. It's present. It's out of this context that there's even more to be known. So you're not deficient, you've already received something, but there is still more. I don't know, I think that's just a helpful perspective for us, because a lot of times we're followers of Christ and we can affirm all that God's given to us. But it would be a problem for us to think that's all there is. I've arrived. I have everything. I'm complete in Him. Well, that's true, but there's also something that's untrue about that, because there's so much more to learn. So much more to learn in many different ways. And particularly, right, the Spirit, when we go back to what Paul is really praying for, is a spirit of wisdom and further insight. Revelation. Well, the accusative is, we could ask about why the accusative, because normally we would think that this could be a genitive absolute. Okay, so and what makes it resultant really is the perfect tenseness of it. That's what makes it a resultant, continued results. But your question is fair. Like I was hoping to get by without having to address that. No, just kidding. I mean, no, it is fair. Like, why accusative? And here we have to think about the basic purpose or significance of each of the cases. So the nominative case is a naming case. Naming, it's pointing out, and often a subject. The genitive is a case of description, but also of separation. The dative is a case of instrumentation, it's combining different senses in the history of the language, also location, and also benefit and personal reception and benefit. The accusative case is a case of extension. That's why it's the direct object. And so the accusative of time is during which, extending throughout which. And so that's where when you can compare the dative of time, the genitive of time, the accusative of time. The genitive of time is a kind of time. It's a characteristic of time. The dative is point in time. The accusative is extension of time. So just looking at the time uses of each of these cases can reveal something of the nature of the case itself. And so those time uses are really instructive. And so here, I think maybe the accusative case as an extensive case, I think shows that there's revelation extended to an already existent illumination, right? So if you would have put this as a genitive absolute, it might have suggested too much of a separate event or separateness. So on the one hand, you got God doing this, but then you have your heart doing this. Whereas the accusative absolute, I think, implies a coextensive, an extension, a realm that is the same or extending within it. And so, anyway, I think that's probably, that'd be my best guess at this point why the accusative of cases is used. So he's basically, I think in the end what he's saying is that you've already received great illumination in the eyes of your heart. You already have it, and it's just a matter of building onto that, extending further beyond what you've, in terms of what you already have. And that's really, I think, important. I do think there's play on mystery cult phenomenon. This idea of illumination is going to come up again in chapter 5, where Christ is the one who enlightens and shines upon us, just as the God and some of the language of mystery cult is that people receive illumination from the God. And the thing is the mystery cults, it really was a mystery. Like, we don't even know exactly, because people were supposed to keep it a secret. Like, what it is, it was revealed. And so here Paul's using the same terminology, same kind of network of ideas, even the same word, mysterion, except it's not a mystery. It's a secret that has become known. It's not to be just kept for secret, personal salvation.
Isn't that what it is in the Mysteries?
Yes, the mysteries.
That's what I said. Down for the I went, I saw, and it's finished.
Yeah.
And now I said, what was inside? Nothing.
Yeah. You're not supposed to talk about it, but this whole language of being complete as well is also part of the mystery cult. And Paul's going to use that language of being complete, teleos. It shows up in 1 Corinthians 13, I think, in a very powerful way, where he talks about, when I become perfect and seeing Christ fully, not as in a mirror, or not just as in a mirror. So anyway, I think there's some shared religious language here that is significant but radically transformed. And now why is Paul praying this? Why is he praying for this kind of revelation spirit, this wisdom? Well, here we get it in verse 18 with this isto idena umas tis estin. Here we get the purpose. Now this is a ramped up purpose clause. In order that you would know. So here the NESB, it's just not strong enough, so that you would know. And the problem with so that in English is so that can mean result, or it can be purpose. So I like to translate it, if it's clearly marked in the Greek text as purpose, I like to explicate it as such and use it in English in order that you would know. In order that you would know. And now here, last week I might have just touched on it, I can't remember. You have 3 instances of the interrogative pronoun tis, T. And you know this is an interrogative pronoun because of the accent over the iota. The indefinite pronoun looks the same as tis, T. Indefinite interrogative pronoun, they have the same forms. But the interrogative pronoun will have an accent over the iota. And that's how you can distinguish them. But we're not in a direct question here. If we follow the punctuation to the end, we see that verse 19 ends with the period. Now, of course, the original manuscripts didn't have punctuation. But our editors will alert you to that. That, it's their best guess of what the punctuation is. So we have interrogative pronouns, what, but we don't have a direct question. So how are these interrogative pronouns functioning? How are they functioning? What would you say? Substantival. Not really. I think I may understand what you're saying because they're part of is statements. So in a sense, they're almost like a predicate adjective pronoun, like what is. So the hope is what? So in that regard, Molly, I think you're kind of close onto it. So Molly says it's a substantive, which would be like a noun. Well, as a pronoun, they're obviously standing in the place of a noun. And the sentence construction, they're really functioning as the predicate pronoun of an is statement. So the hope of his calling is what?
That's more of an adjective, contents, sense, it's a kind of disclosing what is in the content of that.
Yes, okay. So in terms of function, that's right, it's the content of the knowing. So what is it that you're knowing? But they're functioning then as indirect questions, which is the content of the knowing. So what was the original question? You could imagine saying, what is the hope of his calling? Question mark. What is the wealth of his glory, of his inheritance among the saints? Question mark. And what is the surpassing greatness of his power for us who believe, according to the working of the power of his strength? So those are the original questions implied. But Paul states these as indirect questions, as the content of what it is that he's praying that they know, or that God would give, rather. So God would give them a spirit, give them a disposition of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge of Jesus, in order that they would know. And then what they're knowing are indirect questions. Now, in my Koine Greek grammar, I talk about interrogative emphasis. And it's important for us, I think, to think about the role of questions to bring prominence to a discourse. Questions call for the audience to participate in the discourse in a way that a simple statement does not. Right? So if you ask a question, if you're asked a question, you need to engage. I mean, you're expected to engage. And so when Paul is in some of these discourses using a diatribe style with an imaginary, what's called a diatribe, an imaginary partner that he's dialoguing with, and they're asking questions back and forth. Well, what benefit is there in being a Jew or in having the law? That's very engaging. That's an engaging style of discourse. And it's because it has a type of, there's a questioning going on. And there's a debate, and we're drawn to debate. We're drawn to drama. So questions can reflect a kind of a drama, so to speak, an unfolding, what's up? What's going on here? I mean, that's why, like, when there's, you're driving down the road and there's